Time's River by Jim Lee. Chapter 9, The Lion in Winter. Danny. Arriving on the western shore, I turned then to the south once more, for there were still so many miles to go. No sooner, though, did I set forth, a storm swept out of frozen north, and buried me waist-deep in blinding snow. Still slogging on as best I could, though hardly doing any good, I passed by then the opening of a cave. This makeshift shelter's just the thing to shield me from this wintry sting, said I, thinking this hole my life might save. Stepped I in and shoulders dusted, as slowly my eyes adjusted, and tried to seek for dangers in the room. Feeling confident of my choice, when low and deep and purring voice spoke up beside me, hidden in the gloom. "Fear not, O man, for I'm like you. My blood is warm, and I freeze too. So let us call a truce while in this place." So laid I down by mighty cat, and only slightly unnerved that his snoring whiskers tickled on my face. I settled into a seat toward the middle of the bus, rather than at the back, adjacent to the restroom. I had no particular desire to be the first one treated to a sample of such aromas as might emanate from the privy cubicle on a long trip like this. As the vehicle trundled out of the terminal and began to lumber along at the stately pace it would maintain for the better part of the next few days, I leaned back in my seat, to the extent the mechanism would allow, and tried to find my way into the realm of sleep. The shock of the news the paper had brought me, and my subsequent flight, did not make this easy. I realized that my sudden change of plans might be considered tantamount to an admission of guilt by any who might be already eyeing me with suspicion, but it simply could not be helped. I thought I might perhaps be able to explain such a sudden change as the result of panic. I imagined that I could simply explain that I had read the story, and knowing the victim and the fact that I had been possibly the last person to see him alive, considered myself in peril as well. The fact that I was giving the police far more credit for reasonable or imaginative thinking than they deserved did not occur to me at the time. I blame works of fiction for filling my head with such fanciful notions. Still, if there was any solution to be found, I hoped to find it in my dreams, and I had, from quite a young age, heard stories of the horrors visited upon young boys who found themselves the guests of the correctional system. It seemed to me, in my terrified state, that the only chance I might have for the kind of deep sleep I expected to need relied heavily on my ability to stay out of police custody. Even to this day, it strikes me as barbaric that a supposedly civilized society should allow horrors, such as those which have reached my ears, to take place in these laughably named correctional facilities. I assure you, gentle reader, almost no one leaves these places having been corrected. Inside, only one of three things happens. Either killer instincts are discovered and honed, or a new and highly pragmatic set of social skills are developed, or else one becomes a broken shell of a human being. I have come to believe that the powers which shape our society understand full well the nature of these institutions and leave them unreformed, perhaps hoping the legend itself may provide a deterrent beyond that of simple incarceration. If so, I wonder that such is not made part of the sentencing proper. "The defendant is found guilty on 3 counts of aggravated assault and is hereby sentenced to 45 years of anal rape in our dungeon." Frankly, I'm surprised that there are not more humanitarian calls for summary execution. Surely it seems kinder to me, and cannot help but alleviate a burgeoning inmate population. Failing that, I expected that if I found myself in that situation, my first order of business would be to find out what kind of behavior might get one sentenced to solitary confinement and engage in that behavior at the first available opportunity. These were the kinds of thoughts which chased each other through my mind as the great diesel engine carried me farther and farther from my home, holding sleep at bay. Nevertheless, as any person who has ridden the big gray dog can tell you, after enough miles roll beneath you, and the view of the overhead buttons which control your personal supply of light and air ceases to fascinate, sleep will eventually overtake you. The bus which took me from Newfield to the college town wound through many points between, picking up and dropping off passengers. I expected this one to do the same, but with the intervening points likely dispersed farther apart on a cross-country trip. So, with my little bag, containing what now amounted to the entirety of my worldly possessions, doing double duty as a pillow, I eventually drifted off. I found myself at the river's edge, of course, at the end of the clearing path. I walked up the path and found the barber shop, exactly where I expected it to be. The great orange tomcat lay in front of the door, sunning itself. It rolled on its back, looking toward me as I approached. It sprang to its feet, making a sound as it rubbed affectionately around my ankles in greeting. "I have to talk to Stan, Momo," I told the cat. It looked up at me, its eyes wide and dark, waiting. I opened the door, and the cat led the way inside as the little bell rang, announcing me. It seemed all was back to normal, at least in here. Momo sashayed beneath the bat-wing doors into what I was still assuming was the back office. Stan was seated at the front counter. His chin rested atop steepled fingers. There was no one else in the shop, at least not that I could see. I followed his gaze upward and saw he had mounted a television to the ceiling across from him and appeared to be watching a news broadcast. He clicked an old remote at the television. It actually made a clicking sound, and the set was muted. The images on the screen continued to flicker silently. "Ah, Winston! Good to see you again, my boy. A little sooner than I had any right to expect, given the previous frequency of your visits, but perhaps things are changing, eh? What brings you to my humble establishment today?" His tone was cheerful, almost giddy, very much like Momo himself might sound, given language and loquacity and pawing a cornered rodent. "You know why I'm here," I said flatly. "Mazzy was murdered." "I know! So many brutal events for such a small town, don't you think? It's almost like little Newfield has been a magnet for such things, isn't it?" Stan said merrily. "I think the police are looking for me," I continued, trying not to be angered by his flippant tone. "Oh, you don't need to think about that," he said. "They're definitely looking for you. Oh, sure, they were going to try to keep that bit hush-hush, but, of course, they did mention that it was a neighbor who overheard the exchange. Naturally, the hounds descended on the place, offering cash for exclusives, and they found the busybody easily enough," Stan explained calmly. "What am I going to do? You said nothing would happen to me just for saying those words," I cried, my panic beginning to swell. Stan replied, waggling a long, slender finger at me. "That I did not. What I said, if you recall, was this," he said, producing a familiar document. "The human is indemnified against any retaliation from the third party," he quoted. "When the Reverend attempted to lay his hands on you, he was prevented from doing so. I fulfilled my obligations in that regard, Winston. Furthermore, the officers who are investigating the case are not any of mine," he said smugly. "I believe you are familiar with the members of the constabulary in question?" "Foy and Lewis," I muttered. I didn't know how I knew, but suddenly I was certain that it was they who were looking for me. The two that I had watched, over and over again for the better part of a summer, as they went out of their way time and time again to find justice in the matter of Mandy's death, even if they hadn't known that such was what they were doing. "Just so," Stan said. "Good cops, such as there are left in the world, and no agents of mine. If they were mine, I would, of course, have called them off immediately, simply as a matter of professional courtesy, irrespective of my contractual obligation. But those two," he continued, "don't take their orders from me. As for what to do," he waved to the television, "it seems you have already begun a course of action." I looked up at the screen and saw there a frozen, grainy image of myself stepping aboard the bus my body was riding in the waking world above. "While I, personally, understand your reaction, I don't think others will. You were observed leaving the scene of what to others will have seemed a heated altercation. Mazzy is believed to have fled while you were observed laughing hysterically. Your destination was known when you were dropped off at the bus station in Newfield. A simple phone call with your description to a security guard at that destination with access to the cameras will quickly reveal your change of travel plans. Your ticket purchase was in cash, but that will not be sufficient to obscure your trail. Once your trail is identified, a second simple phone call will mobilize personnel in one of many municipalities ahead to advise them to stop this vehicle and locate you. He went on, seeming to warm to the subject. The police are rarely imaginative, and even more rarely have the luxury of entertaining bizarre and convoluted theories. If a simple phone call interview to you had elicited answers which convinced them your conversation with Mazzy was innocuous, they would have widened their net. But of course, you have now made that phone call impossible. Even if you hadn't, these investigators would likely have sensed what you are fairly radiating at this point, a sense of absolute guilt. There are details, of course, which do not seem to fit the narrative. How a young man of your frame could have wrought the level of destruction on the other bodies will puzzle them, for example, but not enough to cause them to abandon you as a suspect. And now, with your attempt to elude them, they will be convinced you are involved. They will attempt to get you to reveal your accomplice, but of course you can't, not without appearing to have lost your sanity. You are, not to put too fine a point on it, screwed. Or at least, he said, holding up one finger for emphasis, a normal person would be. You, however, as we have already established, no longer qualify on that front. I've been waiting to see when you might begin to take your new knowledge out for a test drive, so to speak. Frankly, I'm not sure what you've been waiting for. Regardless, your options are now down to 3. Fix it yourself, ask me to fix it for you, or get ready to spend some time as a guest of the state. Personally, I'd estimate by your tone when you came in that option 2 is off the table, at least for now. It's all right, I'm not offended. In truth, I get that a lot. So, what's it going to be? I really didn't have much to add. He seemed to be right, or at least the scenario he described was certainly plausible enough. This wasn't some missing library book. With multiple bodies involved, there was surely no limit to which the authorities would not go to secure what might be their only lead. I could almost see the chain of events playing out in my mind. Somewhere ahead, a patrol car pulling into a convenient spot in the median strip with instructions to stop this bus. I looked up at the frozen, grainy CCTV image. There was noise in the image. The tape, used to record the footage, had been used and reused many times. This wear and tear on the medium inevitably caused little glitches in the recording. And one thing I knew about magnetic tape, it could fail. What were the odds of any given CCTV tape failing? I had no idea, but my instinct told me that knowing would make the task harder, not easier. As it was, we were likely on the track of the most probable outcome, where the tape worked and the security guard at the bus depot formed the next link in the chain of causality leading to my arrest. But somewhere, not too far away, in the universe next door perhaps, was a tape which had perhaps been chewed up in the spools, perhaps broken, perhaps melted or tangled. Somewhere nearby, there was a world where the security guard had replied somewhat dejectedly to the stern voice on the line that he couldn't retrieve that particular footage. I could hear the aggravated curse come down that line. "Change your door back," I said, already sounding half hypnotized to my own ears. Stan snapped his fingers and barked out a quick, "Done!" I placed my hands on the door and looked at my dim reflection in the glass. I closed my eyes. In my mind, I focused on the ghostly television in the reflected version of the shop where my double stood. I expected to have to strain somehow, to make some grand effort to impose my will on the outcome. Instead, as I watched, an additional knob joined the volume, VHF, and UHF knobs. Beside this addition was stenciled a simple triangle. I knew this meant Delta. Next to it, a tiny superscripted 1. My eyes still closed, I watched my reflection's arm stretch out and grasp the knob and begin to rotate it, turning, with no appreciable effect on the image. Suddenly, there was a narrow flash of static. Go back, I thought. My reflection reversed direction on his rotation, more slowly now. The CCTV image began to fade, first becoming indistinct, and then was replaced completely by incoherent static. That's it, I thought, and my reflection stopped. His hand returned to normal dimensions and pressed against the glass. Without opening my eyes, I now saw what I had seen before, a light building up within myself and my reflection becoming clear and distinct. I could see his eyes clamped tightly shut. Now shift, I thought, and he stepped to his right, my left. I leaned forward, and my double did the same. And what sounded like a snap when I had watched it from behind my younger self in that third-person view now sounded much louder. A huge, resonant, menacing crack that reminded me of a sound I had heard years ago when skating on a vast lake of ice on a day warm enough to begin a thaw. That sound had reverberated up and down across the surface of the entire lake. This sound did not come to me through my ears, but seemed to come up through the ground, through my legs. I stepped forward as the door gave way and heard the sound of Stan's welcome bell as I stepped through, and as the door pivoted on its center pin, anchored in the very bones of the universe. The door rotated 180 degrees, and I felt it settle against a resistance similar to that which had been there before the crack. I pulled my hands away from the door, and in my vision, the light detailing my translucent self ebbed away, returning him to a simple shade once more. I opened my eyes. Stan clicked his little remote, and the sound of his broadcast was restored, only now there was nothing to hear but the soft shh of white noise as static danced on the screen. He clicked it off again. "Expertly done," he said approvingly. "It is always a pleasure to have a chance to watch a master artisan at work honing his craft. Of course, you realize that this only buys you time. They will still be looking for you." "Yes," I agreed, "but my experiences so far have impressed upon me the need for caution," I clarified, gesturing to my eye patch. "Of course. Well, I expect you have much to consider now. Do come back if you feel there's anything I can do for you, at any time." He smiled politely, if a little thinly. "There is one other question I had." I stopped him. Stan raised one eyebrow. "Oh? And what might that be?" "Did you know what would happen to me when I delivered your message?" I asked. "Does it matter how I answer that question? You will either believe that I did, and your distrust of me will grow, or you will believe that I did not, could not, and that distrust will fade, though perhaps slowly. My answer can only serve to accelerate the former, and will not have any effect on the latter. Thus, I see no reason to give it," he replied. I thought about this for a moment, and nodded. I walked out to the ting-ting of the welcome bell. Sure enough, the bus continued to its destination uninterrupted. I disembarked in Colorado Springs, making sure to pull my hood down to cover my face, and made my way to the shadows as quickly as possible. I wasn't sure if my pursuers would try to canvass every bus terminal, but it seemed possible. No one called out, though, and soon I was just another faceless huddle of winter clothing, shutting out the biting January winds as I shuffled down the street. The days which followed are blurred and jumbled in my memory. At first, all of my effort was focused on trying to find ways to stay warm without squandering the tiny amount of money I had brought with me. The day I had arrived, a large storm system had moved in. It seemed to have dropped anchor in the front range of the Rockies, intent on squeezing itself dry before wandering over the plains to the east. As a result, the skies were constantly filled with low clouds. I didn't actually see any mountains until I was among them, in the foothills. If you have never had a handgun explode in your hands, You might find it difficult to understand why someone equipped with a tool just as powerful and faced with such basic primal needs as heat and food would be reluctant to make use of it to satisfy those needs. Similarly, though my most recent effort at shifting, for so I now thought of it, had been successful, I was forcefully reminded every time I looked into the scratch or cracked mirror of a fast food establishment's bathroom that reckless use of my so-called talent could and would further maim or disfigure me if I did not exercise extreme caution. And so I only pondered the idea. A few times I tried. I won a few dollars from a wiry fellow running a 3-card Monte game at the train station. Rather than trying to follow the queen, I simply picked a position at random. Then, using the same visualization technique as I had in the barbershop, except I now imagined a freestanding pivoting door in front of wherever I happened to be standing, I would adjust the knob on a screen on the other side of the door until I saw the card I had chosen flipping over and revealed as the Queen of Hearts, making me the winner. At first, I made a show of closing my eyes and concentrating real hard, but after a few wins, it seemed unnecessary. I could visualize everything quite well, even with my eyes open. It just took a few moments to do it. The wiry fellow seemed good-natured enough at first. I thought to only play a couple times, just enough for a meal or maybe 2. Then I would quit and head over to the McDonald's around the block. After a couple days, though, it appeared he had grown weary of his role as my benefactor and decided he had had enough. And that's how I met Danny. "Well, if it ain't the luckiest bum in town," the card shark said with a mockery of effervescent good cheer. "Coming back to finish me off?" This was, of course, ridiculous. I didn't spend all of my days at the train station. Indeed, I had made a point of not spending too much time anywhere, because I didn't want to end up on anybody's radar. That said, I had seen enough of this guy's normal act with his usual customers, rail passengers mostly, to know that he invariably ended up on the winning side. He'd go easy on some, get them hooked, and then shut them down when the stakes got raised. I had never continued long enough for that. I just wanted a couple bucks for a cheeseburger or 2. "I'm not that lucky," I said, pointing to my eye patch. "Just the same, you've never lost. How am I supposed to make a living?" "Oh, okay. I'm sorry," I said, and began to turn away. "Not so fast, Sonny Jim," he said. "Never let it be said that Mrs. McGinty's boy turned away a potential customer who had ready cash on offer. But you're going to have to up the stakes to give me a chance to break even. Say $20. "Well, I really can't afford that," I said, hesitating. My previous wagers had only been $1 each, and I had eaten the profits each time shortly thereafter. "Oh, I think you can. I got a look at your dough last time. You aren't drinking it away, so I guess you're just being cautious. Well, my lad, the time to throw caution to the winds has come. Either go big or go home. Well, whatever alley you're calling home, anyway," he shrugged nonchalantly. It would be good to get ahead a little. No doubt he had held back on his speed for penny ante wagers as part of his shtick. Of course, he didn't know that it didn't matter to me how fast he moved. "Okay," I said, and fished 2 rumpled $10 bills from my wallet, which I was keeping in my front pocket. I hadn't been robbed yet, but was always trying to be alert to people around me. I could hardly afford to lose what little I had. McGinty smacked a crisp 20 down on the little plastic fold-up table which comprised his arena, and then began his spiel. I had heard it enough times, I could have probably done it for him from memory. He laid out the 3 cards, face down, and then flipped the middle card over to show it was the Queen of Hearts. The other 2 were flipped in turn, revealing jokers. Then he began to swap them back and forth. I was right. He was doing so with a blurring speed far greater than anything I had seen before. I tried to follow, but before long had no certainty as to which was which. He finished with a flourish and made his gesture of presentation. "Which will it be, Sonny Jim? The lady or a joker?" I screwed my face into what I hoped was an expression of fierce deliberation, and, selecting the leftmost card in my mind, began to turn the delta dial on my internal television set. I turned it all the way around, but rather than resolving from gray static into the picture of the queen, it did not change. Perhaps it was part of his routine that when he went into top speed, he never used the left position? I changed my mind and chose the rightmost card, and tried again to turn that imaginary dial. Nothing. "What's it going to be, champ? I can't sit here all day, you know," he said with what sounded like a mostly jovial tone, with only the slightest hint of an edge under it. I began to point from one card to another, tracing the motions as though I were trying to remember how they had gone. But inside I was having a bad feeling. I changed my choice to the middle card and ran the dial through another rotation. Nothing. Either I had lost my ability, or there was no outcome where any of these cards was the queen. The queen, it seemed, was no longer on the table. There was no way to win. On the first day I had come to this station, as the evening commuters were coming and going, I had heard one of McGinty's customers call him a cheater. McGinty had become enraged and began shouting all manner of protestations about sullying his good name and his sainted mother and slanderous lies, and sounded as though he meant to try to summon a police officer to settle the matter. The commuter had backed down, seemingly nervous and not wanting to cause a scene, though it had appeared fairly clear to me that no one in the vicinity could have cared less. I imagined I would fare about the same now, and I dared not let him go through with any threat to flag down a cop. They weren't plentiful, but one did make rounds through the station from time to time, and I was sure he could be located if sufficient ruckus were made. Was there anything else I could do? "Well," I said cautiously, "I know it's not the one on the left." "Are you sure?" he teased. "Which one is the lady, champ? She can be tricksy, you know." "And I know it's not the one on the right," I said carefully. "Ah, so you think the lady lies in the middle," he said triumphantly, reaching for the card. "No!" I barked, and he halted, at least for the moment. There are a few murmurs from people nearby at my shout, and in my peripheral vision I could see a couple of these turn to watch the show unfold. "Well, which is it, sport?" McGinty cooed. He was clearly enjoying this. "I didn't say the queen was in the middle. What I said was that it is not on the left and it is not on the right," I clarified innocently. "Simply turn those over and reveal them as the jokers they are, and it will be clear that I know where the queen is." His eyes narrowed. "What are you trying to imply, Popeye?" A few more spectators turned and joined those already watching. Some had perhaps heard McGinty's tirade before and appeared to be expecting some entertainment. "Why, nothing at all. I'm simply stating that if you turn over the left card, it will be a joker, and that if you turn the right card over, it too will be a joker. Having thus revealed the two jokers, I may be declared the winner, as the only remaining card must be the queen. Right?" I raised my voice on this last, understanding now that he wouldn't want to actually summon anyone. Now that there were spectators from several angles, it would likely be more difficult for him to conceal any further motions. His eyes narrowed further still, and his lips curled into a snarl. "That's not how it works, sport. You pick a card and tell me where the queen is." "But surely," I called aloud, gathering almost all of the remaining bystanders to the growing crowd, "surely it is no different to tell you everywhere she is not as it would be to tell you where she is. Certainly it was not specified when we placed our wager, and should make no difference to an honest man." A hush fell over the little crowd. This was not a grade school classroom, so the sound was not heard, but even so, I felt the soft ooh of provoking response ripple in the air. McGinty balled his hands into fists. He hissed with a deadly whisper, "Are you calling me a cheater?" "Not at all," I cried happily. "On the contrary, I called you an honest man, and dare anyone to say otherwise if you would but turn over the left and right cards and show us the jokers." From behind me, a deep voice called, "What difference does it make, Jack? Turn 'em over. If either one is the queen, the kid loses.
Otherwise, he wins. It's not rocket science."
I didn't dare to turn my head away from the cards to see who this person was, but it was clear that McGinty was familiar with the owner of that voice. "You stay out of this, Danny boy," he growled. "Flip him over," someone else called. A moment later, other murmurs of, "Yeah, flip him over, let's see him," fluttered through the assembled group like fallen autumn leaves. Seeing the tide of public opinion turned against him, McGinty relented, flipping the 2 end cards. "Well, looky here, Popeye is right. Jokers they are. Congratulations, laddie," he grumbled, pulling the thinnest of veils over his hostility as he pushed the bills toward me. I scooped them up quickly, meaning to take my leave immediately. As McGinty reached out to snatch up the remaining card, a large brown hand reached over my head and clamped down, pinning it to the table. Jack squawked in surprise and protest. "What do you think you're doing? Take your hand off of me, you lout!" he shrieked.
"Well," said a thoughtful voice, coming from the tall black man to which the hand was attached, "what with all the commotion and all, I think we're all excited to see the winning card. Aren't we, folks?" He spoke up as he finished, and murmurs of assent came back from the group. Some things never change. These people still wanted a show. "Let go! Let go! Ah!" Jack screamed as the large, strong, black hand slowly but inexorably rotated the smaller white one, the middle card still cupped in it, until the 2 palms faced upward. In it lay a joker, with a wide, laughing grin painted on its face. More murmurs rippled through the crowd, these taking on a darker tone. The black man released his grip, and Jack jerked his hand free. He looked at me and hissed. "I'll kill you for that, you little bag of—" The black man interrupted him. "Considering that you've taken money from a good many of us in the past, and now that we see that you are a cheater, you'll be lucky if the one getting killed isn't you."
Jack turned and swept the crowd with his eyes. It seemed he didn't much care for the looks which met his gaze, for he snatched up the folding table with one practiced motion and fled without another word. I spun around to look up into the face of the man who had stepped in and turned the tide. He looked to me like a football player, tall, with a heavy, muscular build. His scalp was bare, but he wore a goatee. His attire was what I would later come to think of as the homeless onion look. Multiple layers of flannels, and not one, but 2 oversized coats. He held out the great slab of his right arm for a handshake and smiled warmly.
"Nice work, kid. Danny Jacobs. I've seen Jack McGinty swindle many people, but none that could ever catch him in the act. That was mighty satisfying. Mighty satisfying indeed," he said as I shook his hand.
I stammered, drawing a blank. I hadn't even thought to come up with a fake name. This was the first time I had actually spoken to anyone since I took flight, other than ordering burgers. At that moment, all I could think of was McGinty calling me Sonny Jim. Smith seemed too obviously fake, so without thinking, I reverted to the second bogus surname that popped into my head. "Jim Jones," I responded. "Just lucky, I guess." He suppressed a snicker.
"Really? You don't look like a maniacal cult leader. Ah, well, what's in a name? Never mind. It's good to meet you, Jim."
As he said this, he didn't actually make the quote marks in the air with his fingers, but it was clear from his inflection that he believed me not at all, just as it was clear from the smile lines around his eyes that he didn't care.
"You come across a good many Jims and Johns and Daves in places like this," he said cheerfully, "but you're the first Jim Jones I've met. So long as you keep your Kool-Aid to yourself, though, I think we'll get along just fine."
"Thank you, for helping."
"I was glad to do it," he replied, pausing in thought, as his left hand idly stroked his goatee.
The expression on his face suggested this was a familiar gesture, and one of which he was not actively aware.
"Jack will probably not be back any time soon. He'll probably avoid familiar faces for a while, maybe move on to Denver. All the same, it might be well for you not to be on your own if you come across him. He may be a hothead and may be full of wind, or he may not be. It's rarely wise to dismiss an actual threat of death in this world. Do you have any people to go to?" "No," I said flatly. "Not to worry. I'm sure the Padre can find room for you," he said reassuringly. "There's a shelter down on 8th, and it beats huddling next to the dryer vents at the laundromat by a mile," he added. I had stopped noticing the smell of fabric softener which permeated my clothes, but it had clearly not dissipated. "If you were a boozer, you might have problems getting in, but since you're pretty obviously not, you'll be in. No trouble." "I notice he didn't threaten you," I said, looking in the direction Jack had fled. "Yeah," Danny dismissed with a wave. "Probably too fond of his teeth for that," he laughed. I laughed too. It felt good to be able to do that, in spite of everything else. The shelter to which Danny led us looked like it had once served as a small office building. The entrance opened into a small chapel. A hand-painted sign over the door read, "Cleft of the Rock," and underneath, "Father Michael Valderas." There were a few wooden pews, and 2 figures were huddled, apparently in prayer, toward the front, where a small crude podium stood with a wooden cross affixed to its front. To the right of the entrance, a doorway led into a short hall from which delicious aromas wafted. From this doorway approached a small man in a dark robe. His black hair was trimmed short, and he wore a thin mustache. His features seemed Hispanic, perhaps Mexican in ancestry, and he smiled broadly as he strode toward us. I've never been very good at guessing the ages of people, so I'm probably wrong when I say he looked to be in his late 40s. His dark eyes glittered, and he stretched out both hands in a gesture of greeting. "Daniel! God bless you. It is good to see you again. And who is this you have brought with you?" he bubbled. "This is Jim, Padre. He has nowhere to go and no family to take him in," Danny said. "Fear not, my son," said the priest. "All of God's children are welcome here. I am Father Valderas, and this is the Cleft of the Rock," he said, as he clasped my right hand in both of his, and then led us into the hallway. "Our comforts are few, but we have food to give strength to the body, and his word to give strength to our spirit. Come in out of the cold and warm yourself. We have beef stew today, which goes a long way toward helping the body forget the chill outside." In the kitchen area beyond, there were several folding tables and chairs set up, where quite a few people were seated, huddling over bowls of steaming soup. "All we ask is that you help us to keep the devil and his works outside. If you have partaken in his drink or his drugs, you must cast those things aside, for they have no place in the house of the Lord," he said, as he led us to the counter where the stew was being dispensed by a thin boy wearing a hairnet and an apron. "I don't use any of those things," I said. "That is very well. Never start, Jim, for they lead only to places which destroy both the body and the spirit. Daniel, when you are finished eating, will you help Jim find a bunk in the dormitory?" he asked. "Yes, Padre," Danny answered with a solemn nod. "Thank you, Daniel," said Father Valderas. He turned once more to me, his warm regard focused on my lone eye. "Life in this world can be hard, my son. Our kindness to one another eases that burden. We welcome you to our family. If you need prayer, please seek me out. You may stay with us as long as you need to, and any help you may offer in our mission is always appreciated." With that, he turned and strode purposefully back toward the chapel from which we had come. Just like that, my brief stint as a wanderer came to an end. Well, for a while anyway. I spent the rest of that winter and following spring living and working at the little shelter. I began working in the kitchen doing dishes. Volunteering was not required, but the regulars all pitched in. Other faces, the majority, came and went with startling frequency. I had no idea until now that there were so many adrift in the world. The Padre didn't seem to have much in the way of support, save for a couple families that would come in on Sunday for his service in the little chapel. Yet he always seemed to keep food in the kitchen. I helped, at first, because I was simply grateful not to be freezing or starving, and felt it the least I could do to repay the kindness being showed to me.
I attended the Sunday service more out of respect for the man himself than for his message. There were other meetings during the week, but these seemed to be focused on breaking free of substance abuse, so I didn't get involved. Danny told me about a place where we could earn a little money. There was a shabby, poorly lit warehouse off of Nevada Boulevard where you could do assembly work, just snapping together parts for the junk they would sell to tourists during the summer. The people offering the work didn't pay much, but they didn't ask questions either. Payment was based on the number of parts assembled, paid at the end of each day. Some of the people standing in line at day's end were faces I had seen at The Rock, but a fair number of those immediately took their earnings around the corner to the liquor store. None of those were seen at The Rock afterward. Whether the Padre had spies, clairvoyance, or just the respect of the people he helped, few alkies returned to make trouble. Personally, I favored the latter explanation. As the weather warmed, more varieties of work became available. There was a bus that would pick people up downtown and bring them to construction sites on the western edge of the city, where new homes and businesses were spreading out into the flatlands like a plague. At the end of the day, payment was made, again in cash, and the bus brought people back downtown. Most of the unskilled work available was digging trenches, transporting bags of cement or other materials, things like that. The work paid a little better than the piecework assembly, but was exhausting, and soon I told Danny I didn't think it was for me. He smiled and took it in stride, but I was sad to split up the team. Since we had met, I had begun to think of Danny as my new guardian angel. I spent very little of my earnings, other than what I dropped into the collection plate on Sunday. Yet, when he was with me, even the little cliques of aspiring gangsters cut us a wide berth. Since there was no place at the Rock to store valuables, and I hadn't figured out how to go about getting a bank account without using an ID that would reveal my actual name, my growing nest egg became more of a worry with each passing day. Without Danny's protection, the risk would definitely be greater. I had to find somewhere to secure my stash. I mentioned this to Danny, and when he gave me my answer, I chided myself for being so thick-headed as to have not seen it before. At places like the bus terminal and the train station, coin-operated long-term lockers were available. They had them at the bowling alley, too, but the lanes were closed at night, and I preferred to access my stash on my own schedule if possible. The areas were patrolled, and the anonymity was unmatched. I selected a locker as low to the ground as possible, near the little donut shop in the bus terminal, figuring that such a locale would likely get even more frequent passes by the cop who circled the place. I avoided the railway. I hadn't seen Jack since the night I had won the 20 from him, but didn't want to tempt fate. One thing I did purchase for myself, a deck of cards. When I wasn't working or helping out at the Rock, I practiced. I still had no plan as to how to get my life back, but I thought that the more practiced my talent was, the better my chances would be. I focused on rapidly visualizing and shifting to change the outcomes of random events, and as I did so, I learned a few very important things. It was always easier to make something not be so than it was to do the opposite. Or, to put it another way, it is easier to destroy than to create. To achieve a desired outcome, all things need to be considered which might impact the result. All variables calculated, all inputs compensated for, all random influences canceled. This was possible, but required great focus. Depending on the complexity, I found it necessary to add additional dials to my television. Following the initial example, I numbered them with increasing superscripted numbers. Delta squared, cubed, etc. I imagined that these represented orders of magnitude of probability. For something highly unlikely, such as identifying 5 cards randomly selected from the deck, I could start with the higher magnitude dials and then fine-tune the result by moving on to each lower level, until finally locking in the desired outcome on the last dial, seeing the successful image before shifting through my door. Breaking something, though, causing a thing which was to cease to be, that was child's play, comparatively speaking. The whole universe seemed only too eager to turn order into chaos, needing only the least spark of encouragement to make it so. There was one other thing that I tried to do. As I pondered how I might clear my name, It occurred to me that if I knew what had really happened to Mazzy, I might have a better idea what could be done to remove myself from suspicion. If I could figure out who the real killer was, and find a way to convey that to the authorities, the search for me might be called off. It was on a night at the end of May 1987, as I was wondering how I could retrieve such information, when it finally occurred to me how I had met Foy and Lewis in the first place. My machine. The machine I had created in my mind to allow me to fast forward or rewind the view of events in the world, to see everything I had wanted to see, to watch Mandy's father gunned down over and over again. I had left it in a clearing not far from my Green Valley, the mental construct where I had slept away the month of my coma. Mandy's mother, or if Stan had it correct, the songbird who had used her voice, had said that it seemed a fitting place to leave it. Of course, I was beyond restraining myself according to what that particular advice had been, wasn't I? I went to sleep in my bunk in the dormitory. There weren't really any assigned spaces, but the regulars seemed to respect one another's space, and newbies usually seemed eager enough not to make waves. Those who liked making waves had a tendency to move on quickly. As I drifted off to sleep, I tried to remember the clearing where the machine had been. But it had been a long time, and I simply found myself at the end of the path to Stan's clearing. I tried waking up partially and trying to locate it again, with the same result. I sat up in bed, irritated. Perhaps there was another way. I visualized the hilltop where I had seen all of the slumbering iterations of myself sleeping in the tall razor grasses of the Green Valley, and drifted back to sleep. Sure enough, this worked, and I found myself on the hilltop. The grass was all flattened and brown now, but it was the place. I spied the little path that I had climbed to reach this vantage in my previous visits, and walked back down it to where the machine had lain, the light winking off of it like the lustrous scales of some sleeping dragon. It was gone. There was a wide dirt patch where it had clearly been, and indentations in the earth where it had stood, but the machine itself was definitely gone. I awoke, shocked out of sleep, and sat up in my bunk, staring stunned in the dark. If I had been unable to visualize the spot itself, then that might make sense. But how could a mental construct, something which only had reality in my own head, be stolen? I tried to get back to sleep, but for some hours the simple feeling of violation would not permit it. I tossed and turned, making a wadded tangle of my blanket, but I could not find peace. And it didn't feel like something I had merely forgotten. The clearing itself was there, as was the Green Valley. And though these things showed the passage of time, they were otherwise as I remembered. So how could my machine not be there? Eventually, I did return. I was back in the clearing, and the thing was still gone. I examined the dirt for any marks, anything which would give me a clue at what had happened, but there was nothing. Perhaps it had been too long. I just didn't know. Okay, never mind, I thought. This wasn't why I came here anyway. I made the first one. I'll just make another. No problem. So I concentrated and realized I didn't exactly remember how I had done it the first time. I thought perhaps it had been inspired by the microfiche machine at the library. Well, I had better inspirations now, didn't I? If I was going to make myself a ride, why not do it right? I closed the eye of my dreaming mind and thought about what an efficient conveyance might look like. I'd always liked science fiction stories where there was a computer that the characters interacted with just by talking. This wasn't engineering. I didn't need complicated controls. Just some way to interact, and perhaps a nice captain's chair for comfort. A simple black circular disc for the floor, with an illuminated edge to delineate getting in or out, and a padded swiveling chair rising on a short pedestal from its center. Oh, with leather, red leather. Oh, and armrests, and a non-intrusive microphone in a panel built into one of the armrests. Yes, that would do nicely. I could let my subconscious work out how it was supposed to do what it was meant to do. I opened my mind's eye, and there it was, just as I had seen it, though with a couple additions I hadn't expected. A slender joystick, like something off an arcade cabinet, but constructed of some steely metal with a matte finish. It rose out of the right armrest, while 2 buttons lined the left one, next to a fabric-covered speaker grill. Upon closer inspection, these were labeled Action and Shield and were red and blue respectively. Hanging down the front, on the right, draped over the joystick, was a small pair of fuzzy red dice with white spots. When I had gotten my driver's license, I had dreamed of my first car. It had seemed so far away, since there had been no point of getting one to go to college. Everything there was in walking distance. But I had wanted a pair of dice just like this for the rearview mirror when the day finally came. I wondered now if it ever would. I grinned with satisfaction, eager to try it out. I sat in the chair, and immediately I felt a thrumming vibration as some unseen power source jumped to life. The disc on which the whole thing sat began to levitate, rising until it was about a foot off the ground. I stood, and it settled back down again. I sat, and once more the craft floated up about a foot. But there was no sensation of motion or instability. It was as though I was still on solid ground, but the rest of the universe had moved down 1 foot. I tapped the shield button first. These were just like standard slapper buttons from an arcade machine, but seemed to be of some harder polished material like ceramic or stone. This button was a push-on, push-off switch and remained depressed after a tiny click sound. Suddenly, a globe of faint blue haze enveloped the craft, in which the bottom edge of the disc was cradled. I toggled it off again. Seemed simple enough, though I had no idea where my subconscious thought I might be going, that I might require a shield. I tapped the action button. This one returned immediately to its former position, a momentary contact switch. I'd half expected a bolt of laser light to blast out from the disc's edge, but nothing happened. No manual, eh? I joked out loud to myself. I am fully capable of explaining my functions, snapped a sultry female voice. I jumped out of the chair in surprise, and the craft settled to the ground again. You don't seem to have decided whether you want to go anywhere or not. Would you like some time to think it over? She asked, with noticeable sarcasm in her tone. I was just startled, that's all. I definitely know where I want to go, I responded in what I hoped was a confident voice. And when, I said, as I settled back into the chair. The vehicle resumed hovering. Please state destination coordinates, she replied, in a much more businesslike manner. December 17th, 1986. The time was about 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I want to see Reverend Mazzella's house, but, I said hesitantly, I don't want to do anything. I don't want to be seen, and I don't want to interact. I just want to observe, I said, images of the Lucas house ablaze flickering in a dark alcove of my memory. Shield function completely isolates the exterior from the interior, and as such also serves as a cloaking device, she replied. I tapped the shield button again, and the bubble sizzled into existence around us. Okay, let's go, I said. All controls are fully configurable. The action button, for example, may be used to issue manual confirmations of actions deemed hazardous. All temporal translations are potentially hazardous. I have set your destination coordinates as requested. Press the action button to confirm, the woman's voice explained. I thought you said the shield isolated us, I asked. The shield function isolates the exterior region from the interior region, not vice versa. Those outside cannot see you, but you can see them. There are things which can cause disruption simply by virtue of their observation, things which cannot be readily unseen. Therefore, confirmation is required, she went on patiently. Oh, I said, and tapped the action button. I was expecting some dramatic vortex of energy, rockets, pulsing light, the roar of the engine, something. There was none of that. The scene outside the bubble simply changed instantly, and it was December of last year. I was hovering over Mazzie's sidewalk at the same perspective. From my seat, my eye was about 6 feet or so off the ground. I was looking at myself, laughing energetically from a distance of only about 4 feet away. Suddenly, my past self gained control of his laughter, wiped his eye, and began to walk down the sidewalk directly toward me. Hey, how do I move? I blurted. But before I could get an answer, December, Winston, walked through the bubble and through me. What the? It wouldn't be very good isolation if there was a big invisible thing for people on the exterior to bump into, now would it? The voice chided, and the sarcasm popped in for a quick encore before vanishing again. Isolation, while shield is active, is total. Interior is immaterial as well as invisible to exterior objects or persons. To answer your question, proportional control lever is currently configured for spatial orientation. Proportional control, I began to ask, but my eye fell upon the joystick, and the answer seemed self-evident. I nudged the stick to the left, and the view rotated slowly. Again, the stability was total. I literally felt as though I were stationary and the world outside revolved around me. There was a joke there somewhere, but I let it go as this was no time for such things. I tried pushing harder, and the control was indeed proportional. The further I pushed, the faster the scenery blurred by to the right, but I felt no dizziness or vertigo. I centered it again, and the view slowed, then stopped. I nudged the stick backward, and the craft slid back off the sidewalk onto the thin snow cover of the grass, and I could see my younger self walking away. I need to back up about 5 minutes, I said. I scooted the craft backward a little more so I would have a good vantage point of the whole scene. Outside, the world froze solid for a moment. Then there was a flurry of activity, of things moving quickly in reverse, myself walking backward, back toward the door, and beginning to laugh, the old clunker with the fry eater backing up the street, and me laughing some more, and then Mazzy turning backward into view about 4 blocks down, scurrying in reverse toward me. "Stop!" I barked. The scene outside froze. "Resume forward, normal speed," I instructed the ship, and nudged forward to follow Mazzy as he promptly began walking away. He turned his corner, and I goosed the controls a little to catch up, which I did a few moments later around the corner. He continued walking for about 15 minutes, and he seemed nervous. He was constantly looking around behind him. Several times he made additional, unnecessary turns. Finally, he appeared to have arrived at his destination as he approached a rundown multifamily apartment house at the end of the street we were on, just before it entered St. Patrick's Cemetery. He gave an odd little knock. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, 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 tap. The door opened a crack, and he pushed inside immediately, and the door slammed shut again. No time like the present to test the shield, then. I nudged forward, and first the bubble, then myself, phased through the door. Inside, the apartment was sparsely furnished. I was looking at the living room, where there was only a short couch, more like a love seat, and a little table where a tiny TV blared. On the couch, a young girl sat, thoroughly focused on the program. She looked to be about 11 or 12, with very light brown skin. Behind her, I could see into the kitchen, where Mazzy was whispering excitedly to someone. "Have to figure out where you and Brandy can hide out," he was hissing intently. Somewhere beyond him, another voice, a female voice, hissed in equally frantic tones. "We ain't got no place else to go, Richie. You know that. You're the only friend I got left in this world, and it's taking all the money you got just to keep this place," she continued. The owner of the voice pushed her way past Mazzy, carrying a bowl of something steaming, and handed it to the girl on the couch. "Careful," she warned. "It's hot," and plunked a spoon into the contents of the bowl before turning back toward the kitchen. The woman seemed only a few years older than me, perhaps in her mid-20s, surely no older than that. She had beautifully smooth brown skin and was reasonably attractive. I looked past her to the pale reverend and back at the lighter-skinned girl and began putting pieces together. So this was the love nest that the papers would be reporting about, even though the woman seemed young enough to be his daughter, not his lover. These were the 2 females that would be found mutilated alongside Richie. "Well, you can't stay here. If he's sending messages to me, then he could be watching me." The woman froze in obvious horror. "Were you followed?" Mazzy blanched, becoming even paler still. "I tried to be careful. I didn't see anyone, but I don't have any experience with this sort of thing. I haven't been trained to do this." As he said this, she met his eyes, and they were both silent for a moment. They were both clearly terrified. Who were they expecting? If it was Stan, surely Mazzy would be shouting all manner of rebukes and binding up of evil spirits. No, he seemed quite convinced that the source of my message had been flesh and bone. Someone with the training needed to do this, whatever this was. Of course, I knew what this would lead to, didn't I? All three of them were going to be killed. The paralysis of the couple broke. The woman's eyes flicked to the girl on the couch. "Brandy, I want you to pick out a couple change of clothes and put them in your duffel bag. We have to leave for a few days." "Oh, come on, Mom. I'm supposed to go over to Charlene's for her party tomorrow," the girl whined. "Don't argue with your mother!" Mazzy shouted, in a very unreverendish manner, and the girl jerked, startled, and pelted out of the room. "You do the same, Carolyn. I'll make sure the coast is clear," he said, and whirled toward me. I backed out through the door, and then backed through a huge man standing outside of it. I maneuvered the bubble so I could see his face, at least in profile. "Computer, freeze!" I shouted. The newcomer had been reaching toward the doorknob. His left hand stood frozen, curled in midair 2 inches away from it. The hand was connected to a tanned and hairy arm, which poked out of a short-sleeved shirt, despite the frosty weather. The other hand was wielding a wicked-looking combat knife, something which would have looked comfortable in the hand of John Rambo. This was honed to an insanely sharp, almost invisible edge. That arm sported a crudely drawn tattoo of a swastika. The face, which glowered over both these hands, was twisted into a grimace of indescribable hate. I could see the reason for the short-sleeved shirt, though. Idling at the curb was the clunker I had seen sitting outside of Mazzy's place. This was the Fry Eater. Not a man of sensitive digestion after all, as it turned out, but a man with a mission. "Computer, resume forward, normal speed," I said. The Fry Eater grasped the knob and was pulled forward slightly as Mazzy opened the door to peek out. Mazzy began to shout in surprise, but the huge man burst in through the doorway, knocking him backward onto the floor.
"Evening, Rev. I'm here to take back what's mine. Looks like you've been expecting me. Hope you haven't been waiting too long," he snarled, slamming the door behind him as I floated through it.
Mazzy staggered to his feet, trying to adopt a defensive pose, but he was shaking with fear.
"Yes, the boy gave me your message, Kenneth, but as I told you in the courtroom, you lost your right to call her yours when you assaulted her. It is only by the grace of God that she is even alive."
It was obvious to me that he was terrified, yet he stood his ground against this man. Knowing the outcome as I did, I felt a strange emotion welling up in my heart. I was proud of him. This psycho was going to kill him, and Mazzy seemed to know this, but still he blocked the hallway and the women beyond it with his defenseless body. Kenneth, however, was unmoved by the display.
"I don't know nothing about no boy, but I promised her I'd kill her for testifying against me, and Brandy too. Nigger bitches need to know their place. As for you, well, while I was in the joint, the brothers taught me to respect men of the cloth, so I'll do you quick," he growled. "You shouldn't have tried to hide them from me."
This was no love nest. Mazzella had used his own money to try to help this woman and her daughter evade this maniac. His only sin in this situation was perhaps not having the foresight to arm himself against this moment. He simply stood there, hands raised up and out in a stop gesture, like some clueless crossing guard. Kenneth swept the combat knife in a lunging arc, once across Mazzella's throat. A deep gash appeared there and began to fountain blood as Mazzy collapsed bonelessly to the ground. "Freeze again!" I shouted. "We have to stop this," I said to the ship's computer. "We cannot. More specifically, you cannot," she replied. "We have to try," I shouted. "You can try all you like if you enjoy wasting your time," the ship mocked. "Any attempt to directly create a paradox of this magnitude will only create branching pathways which immediately terminate, returning you to the point of deviation." "I don't understand. Do you have any weapons? Something I can use to stop him?" I asked impatiently, pointing at the Fry Eater still locked in place. "I can configure the action button to emit a charged pulse of shield energy, which would normally be sufficient to eliminate a threat, but you cannot stop him this way," she responded wearily. "Then do it, and back up 10 seconds, I commanded. I watched as the scene played itself out in reverse, Mazzy rising from the floor, his throat being sealed by the sweep of Kenneth's knife, after which Kenneth talked in a way that sounded just like a record player being turned in reverse. As this happened, I oriented the ship so I was directly facing the man.
"You shouldn't have tried to hide them from me,"
Kenneth growled again. I stabbed the action button. The intensity of the bubble's glow increased for a moment, and then the excess seemed to sort of slide to a point on the outside immediately in front of me. And then, with a blinding flash, it lanced out and threw the fry eater. Kenneth crumpled to the floor in a heap, with a charred hole in his torso. Mazzy looked around with an expression of abject terror and confusion, as the ship was still invisible, and began to scream. And then, in the very next instant, Kenneth was back on his feet, with a conspicuous lack of torso ventilation.
"You shouldn't have tried to hide them from me,"
Kenneth growled, yet again. "Freeze again," I shouted. "What happened?" I squawked. "As I have already explained," the ship droned with obvious annoyance, "you cannot stop him this way. You are here because of what he does at this time. He is here because the Reverend came here in response to your message. If you stop him now, you would not then reach the point at which you feel the need to stop him, so you would not come here now. Your attempt negates itself, and you return to the point of the branch, the moment of decision." "Isn't there anything I can do to stop him, or at least slow him down?" "Of course. You could turn off the shield," she answered brightly. "Then he will kill you as well, with a probability in excess of 99%. The additional seconds it takes for him to do this will indeed slow him down. However, those seconds are unlikely to affect the outcome of subsequent events." "So what do I do?" I asked hopelessly. "You came here to observe. So, observe. You may learn something which will be useful. If you find an opportunity to affect this sequence of events without invoking total destructive interference, you may yet be able to prevent the thing which is about to take place here," she soothed sympathetically. "It is said that the future is not written in stone, but in truth, neither is the past, not for such as you." I sighed heavily. Very well. Resume forward, normal speed. Once again, Kenneth swept the combat knife in the same lunging arc. Once again, Mazzy began to bleed out and stumbled to the floor. I clamped my eyes shut, but I heard heavy footsteps as Kenneth stepped over him, and the screams of terror of both mother and daughter from down the hall. "Computer, stop. I can't watch any more of this," I choked, feeling my gorge rising. The sound stopped immediately. "Return home," I said, my voice hitching as I spoke. "Home is not currently a definable destination. Please specify destination," she answered, seemingly more mechanical at the moment. "Go back to the point we left to come here," I revised. "Destination set. Press the action button to confirm," she said back. I opened my eyes. The scene was frozen. Kenneth was gone, presumably frozen in position somewhere down the hall. The Reverend lay on the floor, paused in the act of clutching with both hands at the gaping wound across his throat. "I'm sorry, Richard," I muttered to him. "I never meant for this to happen. I don't know if there's any way for me to fix this or not, but I promise you I will try." I clicked the action button, and the scene was instantly replaced with the clearing where I had created the ship. I stood up, and the bubble vanished, and the craft settled back down to the soil. I stepped off of the disk, and was about to try to wake myself, when I thought of its missing predecessor. "How can I keep someone from taking you?" I asked it. Her. I wasn't even sure of the pronoun I should be using at this point. Suddenly, it disappeared. I was about to begin looking around for it when I heard a voice in my head. "I have activated the shield. I am now intangible and invisible to all outside observers. You are my creator. As one of your mental constructs, I have a psychic connection to you which is inviolate. I will disengage the shield on your, and only your, command. I can also come to you at any time, regardless of your location," came the reply. "By what name should I summon you? What should I call you?" I asked, with my thoughts rather than with my mouth, testing this new concept. It must have worked, for the answer came back. "That is up to you," I heard in my mind. There are many things wrong in the world. I don't know if I can fix what I've done, but I have to try. And you are the only hope I have of being able to do that. So I will call you Hope, I told her. Hope. I like it. Thank you. You are very welcome, I said. Thank you for your help. As I said this last, the clearing faded, and I was staring at my pillow, with the sound of the pots and pans clattering distantly in the kitchen as breakfast was being prepared.